when I do protest naked, I try to behave entirely normally. I'm not trying to be aggressive. I'm not trying to be disruptive. Really, I'm just being the elephant in the room. And, I'm a tiny woman. I'm less than 5 foot tall. I'm no threat to anyone.
The female body has forever been the subject of varying degrees of control and coercion, but female bodies should be free. That's the argument put forward by Victoria Bateman, the author of Naked Feminism, Breaking the Cult of Female Modesty, which is published on Friday and joins us now. Morning to Victoria.
Good morning.
Now, you are famously a naked feminist, where you sort of use your body as a sort of protest, I suppose. It's kind of a part artwork, part protest, part sort of challenge to people. Why do you do that?
So society has a problem with women's bodies, and I'm fighting back with the full force of my body and my brain. Across the world, women's bodily freedoms are under threat. And in fact, it's affecting women's freedoms more generally. So if we look in Afghanistan, for example, the Taliban pulling women out of schools, out of the workplace, out of public parks, all because they view their bodily modesty as more important than anything else. We look in Iran, we see the Taliban, we see the Iranian authorities continuing to crack down on women who reveal their hair, shooting at them in the street. And even we've had stories recently of girls being gassed in their own school as punishment for their protest efforts. And then in America, we see the rise of purity culture. We see, for example, virginity pledges, modesty ponchos, chastity balls, and with it a whole movement to deprive women of access to birth control and abortion. And even here in the UK, just a week or two ago, we had stories of a school up in Merseyside where girls were literally being lined up to have their skirts measured, with a view that women have to choose between their bodies and their brains. That in order to get an education, you need to arrive in school looking suitably modest. So with all of these attacks on women's freedoms across the world, with what I see as a rise in Puritanism, we need to break the cult of female modesty.
So, right, you think there's a sort of new Puritanism, and we're having this conversation, and you're on a Zoom call, and you're completely naked when we're having this conversation. Does that unsettle some people? Do you think this is a good thing to unsettle people? Because there's people who say, I respect women, I want women to make autocratic choices of their own body, but I don't necessarily agree with parading naked around the streets. Those two things aren't necessarily an equivalence.
Yeah, I mean, you might think that there are very few Puritans left these days, object to the type of bodily modesty I have on display today. But many years of naked protesting has shown me otherwise. And I think, sadly, increasingly, immodest women like me are seen as responsible for women in general being viewed as sex objects. Throughout history, women's bodies have been blamed for all kinds of problems, from earthquakes to wars. And now, immodest women like me are blamed for sexism. And ultimately, it's not women like me that need to change. Women should be free to do whatever they want with their bodies, as well as with their brains. And what needs to change are attitudes. And I think more than anything else, the way society divides women up into good girls and, to use a slightly nicer word, harlots, and views those harlots as responsible for all kinds of problems. And if we set a wrecking ball loose on that division between women and ensure that all women are treated with respect, regardless of their bodily modesty, it would be transformative for women's rights across the globe. We wouldn't have women being pulled out of school in Afghanistan. We wouldn't have women being shot at in the street in Iran. Women could, in America, have full rights over their own fertility, and we wouldn't be lining girls up in UK schools to have their skirts measured. Challenge the cult of female modesty, and you challenge a whole set of policies and practices that limit women's freedom across the world.
Victoria, it's Kate. Can I ask you something?
Hello,
What's the most frequent reaction you get to the fact that you are completely naked what's people's initial reaction, and does it change after you've spoken to them?
Well, the reaction can be quite varied. And, you know, when I do protest naked, I try to behave entirely normally. You know, I'm not trying to be aggressive. I'm not trying to be disruptive. Really, I'm just being the elephant in the room. And, you know, I'm a tiny woman. I'm less than 5 foot tall. I'm no threat to anyone. But interestingly, some people do see a woman in charge of her own body as a threat. So some people do shy away. You know, I think a lot of people are used to having women's bodies available on demand when they want it, not a woman being in charge of her own body, using it for her own purposes, for her own political messaging. But I think interestingly, some of the most negative response I've had has been from fellow feminists. And I think what's really worrying is that in our current puritanical comeback, you're seeing this stream of puritanism within feminism. And you know, that goes all the way back to the suffragettes. So the suffragettes were obsessed with female respectability, so much so that it was embedded in the white stripe within their tricolour branding, you know, between the purple and the green. Sorry.
Go on, Victoria. You're very good at unsettling people by being naked. You're even better at talking. And I think those two together are a mighty combination. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
That's Victoria Bateman there, author of the book Naked Feminism. And we're having this conversation with her completely. She was wearing a little scarf.